At the time of the Hittite downfall, Assyria was already an old, scarred wolf that had known fat times and lean. Its people were the descendants of Semites who had settled along the middle Tigris and eventually looked for political leadership to Ashur. The city, so called for the god Ashur, who became the national deity and also gave his name to the Assyrians. Fertile soil of the Assyrian plains produced fine crops of barley and sesame and good pasturage for cattle and horses. And much of the country is blessed by rainfall sufficient to render irrigation unnecessary in normal times. Assyria was therefore an object of envy to the predatory peoples of the grim mountains and barren steppes in the north and east. Moreover, it was only natural that the established powers of the Middle East should seek to control a territory that by accident of geography lay athwart the major trade routes between Babylonia and Anatolia from the Mediterranean east beyond the Zagros Mountains. For survival's sake, Assyria's sturdy farmers became fierce warriors, who fought at first in defense of their homeland, and then to maintain their security by establishing around them a ring of buffer states. And finally, in a progression that was perhaps inevitable, to expand an empire that, in military might, would stand second to none. In so doing, they wrote a bloody chapter in the history of humankind, one that was all the uglier because it featured deliberate terror and atrocity as instruments of foreign policy. In an early example of the frightfulness that would later become an Assyrian hallmark, a king named Shalmaneser I, who reigned from 1274 to 1245 BCE, carried 14,000 defeated enemy soldiers off to Assyria as slaves, after securing their docility by blinding them. By then, the Assyrians had sloughed off their one-time overlords, the Mitanni, and secured a realm of some 12,000 square miles that stretched from the foothills of the Zagros west to the Euphrates. Shalmaneser's son, Tiglath-Pileser I, whose reign began in 1244 BCE, significantly expanded that territory. For many years, the northeastern Assyrian frontier had been raided by Hurrian tribes who dwelled in the Zagros, a region known to the Assyrians as the Nahri lands. Determined to stop the incursions and to acquire for himself metals, cattle, and horses with which the northern clans were amply endowed, Tiglath-Pileser marched into the mountains and defeated, by his count, no fewer than 40 kings from Nahri, whom he enslaved and transported to Assur, with heavy copper chains around their bowed necks. In time they were allowed to return home as vassals. While Tiglath-Pileser was busy with the Nahri lands, trouble arose in the more important front. For longer than a century, Babylonia and Assyria had been at odds over claims to the territory that lay between them. Now, Babylonian's king Tiglath saw what he thought was an opportunity to settle matters by attacking his preoccupied neighbor. It was a monumental mistake. Tiglath-Pileser rushed back with his warriors from the north, overwhelmed the Babylonian armies, captured the brash Tiglath, and, in Assyrian's own words, trod with my feet upon his royal neck as though it was a footstool. Babylon was looted, and Tiglath-Pileser declared himself the king of Babylonia. The huge statue of Marduk, Babylonian's greatest deity, was hauled away to Ashur. The results of victory over Babylonia were not all beneficial. A nation of rude peasants and warriors, Assyria was now exposed to Babylon's strong, sophisticated, and pervasive culture. Factions sympathetic to Babylon found firm foothold in the Assyrian homeland. The stolen Marduk rose to prominence among Assyrian deities. Accordingly, when Babylonia later rose in successful revolt, it was taken in high Assyrian circles that the plundered gods were demonstrating their anger over Tiglath-Pileser's misdeeds. And so, according to a chronicle, it happened that Tiglath-Pileser, who had brought his hand for evil against Babylon, came to a sorry end. His son and the nobles of Assyria rebelled against him and tore him from his throne. They shut him up and slew him with a sword. After Tiglath-Pileser's death in 1208, less than a decade before the Hittite Empire was crushed by rampaging sea peoples, Assyria suffered an extended period of internal confusion and economic disarray. During this time, too, the fires of conflict, heating ever-turbulent crucible of the Middle East, burned particularly hot as aggressive peoples, such as the Philistines, Arameans, Hebrews, and Canaanites, pushed and shoved one another for a position. In these widely unsettled conditions, almost a century would pass before Assyrians were prepared to step into the void that the Hittites had left in the Middle Eastern power structure. At last, under Tiglath-Pileser I, who assumed the throne in 1115 BCE, the country's agricultural economy was made to flourish. With prosperity came political stability, and the king could concentrate on military matters so important to Assyrian rulers. Changes were being made in the Assyrian army. Although charioteers remained the elite, a new form of warfare was evolving, crushing attacks by a massed weight of infantry drawn from the peasantry, wielding bronze weapons and protected by bronze helmets, corselets, and shields. Tiglath-Pileser soon put the new tactics to a test. The same year in which Tiglath-Pileser became king, Assyria was threatened by tribespeople known as the Mushki, who had crossed the Taurus Mountains to Anatolia and were moving down the Tigris towards Nineveh. Tiglath-Pileser eagerly advanced to meet them, and before long the severed heads of the Mushki chieftains were decorating Nineveh's gates. Next, he launched an attack on the hill folks of the Nari lands, who had risen up against their Assyrian masters. Traversing 16 mountains, he triumphed over an alliance of 23 Nari chiefs, while driving 60 others and their people northward. From the tribes they had subjugated, the victorious Assyrians extracted an enormous annual tribute consisting of 12,000 horses and 2,000 cattle. More menacing than either the Mushki or the Nari were the Arameans. These Semitic people had moved east from the Syrian desert and settled along the entire length of the Euphrates from the Babylonian border northward. Standing as a barrier to the trade between Assyria and the Syrian coast, they constantly raided Assyrian territory. To remedy the situation, Tiglath-Pileser took his army across the Euphrates on rafts of inflated goatskin, scattered the Arameans, and penetrated to the shores of the Mediterranean, where he won trade agreements from the Phoenician city-states and, in recognition of his imperial status, was honored with the gift of a crocodile from none other than the Egyptian pharaoh himself. While visiting Egypt, Tiglath-Pileser also disported himself on a boat ride using a harpoon to slay, as he recounted, a Nahiru, that which they call a seahorse, probably a dolphin or some species of whale. During his long reign, Tiglath-Pileser launched 27 more campaigns against the vexatious Arameans, yet never completely subdued them. After his death in 1077 BCE, the routes to the Mediterranean were severed, and the Assyrian expansion was checked by steady pressure from the Aramean tribes. Nearly another century and a half passed before Assyria resumed the march to empire that would win supremacy over the Middle East. By then, the pattern of Assyrian life was fully formed. Assyria was mainly a nation of serfs who were attached to the land that they farmed. They could be sold along with the real estate. They owed allegiance to the local village. The village, in turn, was tied to a city by the obligation to pay taxes, participate in religious festivals, and obey administrative mandates. The cities, chief among them were Ashur, Nineveh, Erbel, and Nimrud, were under the authority of the king. In theory, the Assyrian king possessed absolute power in all aspects of government: economic, diplomatic, political, military, and religious. Although acknowledged as human, he was thought to be the earthly delegate of the gods, especially of Ashur, the principal deity, who was represented by a winged disk. Because of that status, the monarch was aloof from other mortals. Only the superintendent of the palace had regular access to his presence. Even the crown prince was allowed audience only when omens were deemed auspicious, and outsiders were blindfolded when they appeared in court before their ruler. For the king, satisfying the gods was no easy task. He was constantly subjected to such arduous rituals as fasting or retreating for a week at a time to a crude reed hut. Sometimes the omens indicated the gods were direly displeased. The most evil sign was an eclipse, lunar or solar, which was taken to portend the death of the monarch. In such cases, the king abdicated his throne temporarily in favor of a surrogate, who assumed responsibility for whatever had angered the gods. At the end of 100 days, the real king returned, and both the substitute and the substitute's wife were executed, presumably to give the gods the death of the king that had been foretold. The Assyrian kings and their subjects believed that they were surrounded by hordes of demons, as well as gods. Among the most odious and fearsome was the fever demon Lamashtu, female spirit who specialized in killing infants and women in childbirth. She was seen as a fiend with a lion's head, teeth of a dog, legs of a panther bearing eagle claws. She was believed to roar like a leopard while clutching writhing snake and suckling a pig and a black dog to her pendulous breasts. Such monsters were able to penetrate the bodies of both virtuous and wicked humans, thereby causing all the woes with which people were afflicted. Fortunately, Assyrian demons were considered on the whole a doltish lot. With the help of a priestly exorcist known as an ashipu, they could frequently be duped into turning their malevolent attentions to a sacrificial animal. A chronicler related how, with an ashipu presiding, a sick man would share his bed with a goat kid overnight. At dawn, the demon who caused the man's illness, mistaking the goat for a human, would leave the man and enter the kid. At this point, the kid's throat would be slit and the man would be cured. Demands of the gods and onslaughts of demons put restrictions on royal authority. No Assyrian king would consider making a major decision without consulting a host of priests, oracles, exorcists, diviners, astrologers, and soothsayers, who in effect became powers behind the throne. These religious functionaries were enthralled by the culture that Babylonia inherited from ancient Sumer. The Assyrians, whose own heritage was primitive, fervently believed that what was old was good and must be preserved. Innovation, dangerous, and should be avoided. Assyrian thought, religious and otherwise, was permeated by that aversion. Of the hundreds of Assyrian gods, most were of Sumerian origin. Ashur, the chief native deity, took on attributes of Sumer's principal god Enlil and Babylonia's Marduk, even while the two divinities were revered in their own right. Assyrian law was based largely on the code promulgated in the 18th century BC by Babylonia's King Hammurabi. Assyrian astronomy, along with mathematics required to support it, reflected the Babylonian interest in the heavens. Many Assyrian scribes were trained in Babylonia and remained faithful to the Babylonian model in their literature. Like the Babylonians, Assyrian artists tirelessly depicted military exploits of their kings, although Assyrian sculptors also devoted original talent for rendering scenes of the hunt, the favorite sport of Assyrian monarchs. During a single expedition, Tiglath-Pileser I slew 4 bull elephants, 4 wild oxen, and an astounding total of 920 lions, or so the Assyrian scribes relate. The Assyrians' main intellectual pursuit was collating the knowledge already accumulated by Babylonians and their Sumerian predecessors. A great library the Assyrians built at Nineveh was filled with cuneiform tablets containing compilations of Mesopotamian religious rituals, prayers, omens, incantations, and curses, along with exhaustive lists of gods, heavenly bodies, minerals, trees, foods, household furnishings, and virtually every other subject to which ancient Mesopotamians had turned their attention. Only in the art and science of warfare did the Assyrians display any great interest in new techniques. Their immense armies, sometimes numbering as many as 200,000 troops eventually, were divided into 4 branches. The light infantry was largely manned by archers with powerful composite bows constructed of glued-together wood, bone, and other materials. Heavy infantry, the shock troops, wielded bronze spears and swords. Chariotry was gradually giving way to cavalry. As the newest branch, cavalry underwent several experimental stages. At first, cavalrymen were little more than highly mobile archers, each accompanied by a mounted attendant who held the reins of his master's horse, while the archer dismounted to unleash his arrows. Later, the shield-bearing attendant rode alongside and grasped the reins of both horses, while the archer fired at a gallop. Finally, as their skills matured, archers rode and fought alone as true cavalrymen. The Assyrian army could march 30 miles a day along roads, some of them paved with stone, that had been constructed throughout the empire by military engineers. The roads also proved an invaluable communications network. Couriers on relays of horses could carry messages to any part of the empire and bring back answers within a week. Even where there were no roads, the tough Assyrian soldiers advanced relentlessly. One prideful monarch said of his pursuit of an enemy through the mountains, "I led the way like a fierce wild bull with my picked bodyguards and merciless battle troops. I traversed wadis, torrents, ravines, and dangerous slopes in my sedan chair. Where it was too hard going for my sedan chair, I took to my feet and went on in pursuit to the high peaks, like a gazelle." Once in battle, the Assyrians asked for and gave no quarter. They rejoiced in the butchery. "I cut their throats like sheep," recorded a king. "My prancing steeds plunged into their welling blood as into a river. The wheels of my battle chariot were bespattered with blood and filth." Military aggression was confirmed by Assyrian religion. Conquest was the divine mission of kings, claimed one monarch. "Ashur, father of the gods, empowered me to make broad the boundary of the land of Assyria." All the kings harked to the militant mandate. By the start of the 9th century BC, and the reign of Ashurbanipal II, the Assyrians were again marching to the west. While carrying Assyrian arms to the Mediterranean for the first time in 200 years, Ashurbanipal waged a campaign that would eclipse the dread deeds of his forebears. "I caused great slaughter," he boasted. "I destroyed, I demolished, I burned. I took their warriors prisoner and impaled them on stakes before their cities." After sacking one city, Ashurbanipal stacked the corpses of the dead like firewood outside the gate, and then flayed the nobles, as many as had rebelled, and spread their skins out on the piles. After another battle, in which he killed 3,000 soldiers and took many prisoners, he reported, "Many of the captives I burned in a fire, many I took alive. For some, I cut off their hands to the wrist. For others, I cut off their noses, ears, and fingers. I put out the eyes of many of the soldiers. I burnt their young men and women to death." This was something new. To be sure, the Middle East was inured to horror. The Assyrians had indulged in atrocity before. Now and henceforth, however, the region was confronted by a succession of Assyrian kings who, by deliberate design, practiced and proclaimed mutilations, flayings, impalements, and other atrocities for the purpose of spreading terror and thereby encouraging submission. By savage irony, that policy was from first to last a dismal failure. Time after time, hardly had the main Assyrian army withdrawn from a vanquished nation, leaving behind the mangled citizenry, then revolt flared. To dilute and disperse the potentially rebellious populations, Assyrians hit upon a debilitating expedient. They shuffled conquered peoples around the Assyrian Empire on a massive scale, both to obtain forced labor and security. Some civilians were taken to the Assyrian homeland, where they were put to work as artisans or as laborers on farms and public projects. Others were transported to lands that, like their own, had been depopulated by Assyrian deportations. In a renowned instance of the relocation policy at work, the Bible laments that after the Assyrians conquered Samaria, a province of Israel, they carried off the Israelites to Assyria, and the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in Samaria instead of the people of Israel. In time, the Assyrians came to depend on the conquered populations. To support their military ventures, they dragooned entire enemy units into their armies. After King Sargon II built a new capital, Khoraspad, in 713 BCE, he wrote that he had settled it with peoples from the four quarters of strange tongues and different speech, dwelling in the mountains and in the plains. As many as 4 million people may have thus been shifted about the Assyrian Empire during the last 3 centuries of its existence. And so, with coiffed beards and bloodied hands, Assyrian kings marched in grisly procession across the Middle Eastern stage. In 745 BCE, a king named Tiglath-Pileser III captured Aramean Damascus after a brutal campaign. That ended the military threat of the Arameans, who thereafter, to the benefit of themselves, the Assyrians and the Middle East as a whole, then turned their energies almost exclusively to trade. So ubiquitous were their traveling traders that Aramean became a kind of lingua franca of the ancient Near East, understood and spoken by people throughout the region. A few years later, in 721, the Assyrian king Sargon II put an end to a major annoyance from the bothersome kingdom of Urartu, which had been formed by consolidation of old Nari tribes and for nearly a century been pressing in on Assyria from the north. Assyrian morale suffered severely during the hard campaign into Urartu's mountains, wrote Sargon. The harassed enemy of Ashur, who had come a long way, very weary and slow to respond, who had crossed and recrossed sheer mountains innumerable, of great trouble for ascent and descent, their morale turned mutinous. I could give no ease for their weariness. Unable to rely on his main body of troops, he met the Urartians in a narrow defile with only his personal household cavalry. Standing in his battle chariot, he led headlong charge. The stunned Urartians retreated, at which the main Assyrian army took heart and fell furiously upon the enemy, forcing them into a rout in which great numbers died of exposure in the mountain cold. Sargon II's successor, Sennacherib, lavished loving attentions on the city of Nineveh, which he took as his capital and beautified with a splendid park. He described it as being like Mount Amanus, wherein were set all kinds of plants and fruit trees such as grown in the mountains and in Chaldea. Yet, for all his aesthetic sensitivities, Sennacherib was a true Assyrian ruler, achieving a remarkable reputation for cruelty that contributed to his downfall. He sacked resurgent Babylon in such utterly ruthless fashion that he incurred bitter enmity of the durable pro-Babylon faction within his own country, which had him assassinated by two of his own sons. Another son, Esarhaddon, then avenged his father by shattering the regicide's army and seizing the throne for himself. "I am Esarhaddon," he proclaimed, "king of the world." But he was careful to atone for a sacrilege of his father. He rebuilt Babylon, symbolically molding a brick with his own royal hands. In the west, where Egypt and the Assyrian Empire were separated only by the Sinai Desert, the rulers of the Nile had long incited revolt amongst Assyria's Palestinian and Syrian dependencies. Determined to put an end to such provocations, Esarhaddon, in the year 671, marched 15 days across the Sinai, which was, he said, infested by two-headed snakes, and captured the Egyptian capital of Memphis. No sooner had he withdrawn, however, than the Egyptians rebelled. He set out to recapture Memphis in 669, but died on the way. The empire was divided between two sons, Shamash-Shumi-Ukin, who reigned over Babylonia, and Ashurbanipal, who ruled all the rest. For a time, the arrangement worked. Ashurbanipal reconquered Memphis and extended Assyria's Egyptian domain as far south as Thebes. But jealousy festered within Shamash-Shumi-Ukin, and in 652 his troops attacked a garrison near Babylon, commanded by Ashurbanipal. Soon civil war raged across the land. It ended only after a 3-year siege of Babylon. In the final days, the dead were piled high in the city streets, and chroniclers recounted that survivors ate the flesh of their sons and daughters for their starvation. At the last, Shamash-Shumi-Ukin flung himself into the flames of his blazing palace. After giving his brother a burial befitting his royal blood, Ashurbanipal extracted an appalling revenge against the other rebels. "I fed their corpses, cut into small pieces, to the dogs, pigs, vultures, eagles, birds of the sky, and to the fish of the ocean," he boasted. Curiously, Ashurbanipal would be remembered not as the brute of Babylon, but as a scholarly ruler who boasted of his own literacy, who created a great library at Nineveh, and, by bringing calm to the Middle East, and earned a contemporary saying, "Throughout all lands a peace prevailed, like the finest oil were the world's 4 quarters." When the studious old warrior's 43-year reign ended on his death in 626 BC, the Assyrian Empire seemed at the summit of its power and prestige. In fact, it was on the brink of extinction. The end came so swiftly and so complete that few details were known. Clearly, Assyria had spread itself thin by its maintenance of a vast empire, yet just as clearly its long-time policies had at last brought their calamitous reward. Assyria's atrocious behavior had made it the object of seething hatreds. Its huge army was shot through and through with discontented units, incorporated from defeated foes, and thanks to its infamous deportation programs, its great cities may have housed more inhabitants of foreign extraction than native Assyrians. Scarcely had Ashurbanipal been placed in his tomb than the Babylonian throne was seized by Nabopolassar. He was a sheik of the Chaldean tribes, Semitic people who had settled in the swamps and marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. Within a few years, the Chaldeans formed an aggressive alliance with the Indo-European Medes, who had migrated to western Iran, and with the fierce Scythians, who had swept southward from their homeland in Central Asia. In 612 BC, the allies marched against Assyria, whose king, Sin-Shar-ishkun, embroiled in factional fighting at home, unsuccessfully battled them at Kablini and Arapha, then took refuge behind the walls of Nineveh. The heavily fortified Assyrian capital fell within 3 months, and although the tattered remnants of the Assyrian army fought a running battle for another few years, they were finally eradicated in an engagement at Carchemish. The Assyrian Empire was no more, and the rest of the Middle East celebrated its downfall. Declared the biblical prophet Nahum, "All who hear the news of you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not yet come your unceasing evil." The victors of Carchemish had surprisingly little dispute about dividing the spoils. The Medes assumed power in eastern Assyria, in the former Assyrian provinces north and east of the Tigris. Almost unnoticed, but soon to be of momentous consequence, was the relegation of the Persians, a group of Indo-European tribes who had settled in ancient Elam, to vassalage under the Medes. As for the Babylonians, Nabopolassar died within a year of his triumph, and was succeeded by his son Nebuchadnezzar II, an experienced soldier who swiftly moved to take over the western reaches of the Assyrian Empire. He subdued Syria and extended his realm to the border of Egypt, which had by then regained its independence. The little kingdom of Judah remained a trouble spot. There, despite calamitous warnings from the prophet Jeremiah, King Jehoiakim ignored his promise to pay tribute to Babylonia. No man to trifle with, Nebuchadnezzar laid successful siege to Jerusalem, and although sparing the city, took more than 10,000 leading Jewish citizens back to Babylon as hostages for future good behavior. Yet only a decade later, Judah's king Zedekiah, who had been installed as a Babylonian vassal, conspired with Egypt and Phoenicia to oust the Chaldean overlord. Nebuchadnezzar marched again. This time he meant to obliterate the annoyance. Jerusalem was utterly destroyed, and its remaining inhabitants, except for the very poorest, were taken to Babylon. At home, Nebuchadnezzar was an enlightened monarch who dedicated himself to restoring Babylon to its ancient grandeur. Among many other projects, he erected a magnificent temple for Marduk, and, because his Median wife still yearned for her native mountains, built a new palace high on the hill that was terraced and profusely planted, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which would come to be counted as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But in the Middle East, all empires were temporal, and so it was with Chaldean Babylonia. The empire would not long survive Nebuchadnezzar, who died in 562 BCE. In Persia, a young prince had cast off the yoke of the Medes and would soon embark on a military campaign that would overwhelm Babylonia. He would become known as Cyrus the Great, and would create an empire surpassing any the world had ever seen.